Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I am delighted this evening to be joined by Grace Blakeley. Grace, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we haven't been on together for a while. Very excited for this.
Feels like a very long time.
We've got a somewhat policy-heavy evening for you as well, because the Green Party have released their manifesto. We'll be going through that. Also, a report by the United Nations has accused Israel of crimes against humanity in Gaza. It's also accused Hamas of war crimes. Rishi Sunak has also, you've probably seen this on Twitter if you've been on today, he's failed another normality test. We'll show you the cringe-inducing email and actually some of the ridiculous aftermath that it has created, involving sort of Keir Starmer decrying that he didn't have access to time travel as a small child. The Greens are hoping for their best ever election result on July the 4th, and today the party has launched its manifesto, branded as representing real hope, real change. Overall, the Greens' plan is one of investing in crumbling public services funded by taxing the rich. Here's more from Green co-leaders Carla Denyer and Adrian Ramsey at the manifesto launch in Hove.
Our manifesto is based on investing to mend broken Britain and offer real hope and real change.
Our manifesto is about the sort of country we want to live in, where we move beyond the politics of fear and distrust. The sort of safe and brighter future we want to build for our children. The sort of world we want to build together. A world where everyone has access to the health services they need. Everyone has a warm and secure home. And we all have clean air to breathe.
So when I had Carla Denyer on the show, I did ask her whether she thought, this co-leadership system in the Green Party was really helpful. She gave a very good answer. She said sort of this means that people with, young children or with different caring duties can lead a political party. Very, very worthy, very important. I do think that manifesto launch looked a bit like, when you're in primary school or secondary school and you get tasked with a group project, and then at the end, you have to sort of present it to class and everyone's saying, well, who's going to say the first two sentences? Okay, you say the first two sentences, then I'll say the next two sentences. It's all a little bit awkward, and then it's sort of not aided by the fact that the camera's moving so slowly from person to person. Anyway, I promised you policy analysis of this Green Manifesto. So I'll move beyond the superficial, but I think that had to be said. The Greens, in their manifesto, also have a message for the CEOs of major companies ripping us off while providing crappy public services.
We plan to transform our economy for good. We can't go on with an economy where most people are working harder and yet getting poorer while inequality keeps growing. We reject an economy based on unfairness and instead embrace a fairer, greener economy. Our manifesto lays out a bold but simple plan to bring our water companies, our railways, and the big five retail energy companies into public ownership. We would end... This would end the rip-off of rising bills, appalling service, and shareholders trousering millions.
The Greens also say they'll take action on the housing crisis. Speaking at the manifesto launch, Brighton Pavilion candidate Sian Berry spoke of her experiences in the housing market.
I'm a renter. I have been all my adult life. And for the most part, I've been really safe in the flats I've rented and I've got by. I've had pretty decent landlords and no major problems over the years. But I have in the past really struggled to pay the rent. In general, I've been very lucky though, but for renters up and down this country, the huge expense and uncertainty of renting is something that keeps them up at night all of the time.
I do hope she gets elected MP. I think she'd be, a good addition to Parliament. The Greens say they have a fair deal for renters. The plan includes rent controls decided locally, depending on the local housing market. And here's more from Berry at the launch.
Ending the housing crisis is right at the top of what people tell me they need. Brighton rents last year rose faster than almost anywhere else. But wherever you are, having a home to live in where you feel secure and safe is a basic building block of life and something we should all have as a right. As Greens standing in this election, we all have a strong commitment to making this right a reality.
It's interesting actually thinking about this because obviously, a manifesto launch, you might think it's surprising to be talking about a particular constituency, but obviously the Greens have about, in reality, about 4 target seats. The maximum they can win probably, realistically is about 4. I think they'll probably win 2, so Brighton and Bristol. But that means that actually this manifesto is really actually directed at, people in those 4 constituencies. And so it makes sense that their manifesto launch, they're specifically talking about the residents of Brighton, even if it does sound somewhat curious. Let's take you through some more of the Green policies. It was actually a huge document, so I kind of just picked out some of the ones I found most interesting. They pledged to create 150,000 new social homes every year by the end of the next Parliament. Very good. Scrap tuition fees and abolish Ofsted. I'm not actually sure about abolishing Ofsted. We can discuss that later. Making personal social care free at the point of use, like the NHS. Very good. Implement a 10-to-1 pay ratio in public and private sectors. A minimum wage of £15, universal for all ages. Expanded access to green spaces with a right to roam act. Stopping all fossil fuel projects and cancelling Rosebank, so that's an existing one. Phasing out all nuclear energy. Not sure about that personally. Wind power to provide 70% of UK energy by 2030. Decriminalise possession of all illegal drugs. End illegal occupation of Palestinian land. Support Ukraine against Russia's invasion. Grace, it's quite lots of policies, policy-heavy manifesto, sort of a bit like Labour in 2019, I suppose. Are you impressed with the Green Party's offer?
Yeah, I think I am. And the reason that I am is because I think it's a similar sort of thing as what I would say about the Lib Dem manifesto. It kind of pushes back against these 2 lines that we're getting from both of the 2 main political parties, so Labour and the Conservatives, both basically saying there's no money left. And there's no way to rectify the fact that there's no money left. We're going to have to cut spending on public services, even if they're not saying they're going to have to cut spending on public services. Labour's fiscal rule means that they are effectively going to either have to, cut public services or raise taxes. And they've pledged not to raise taxes. And the IFS have called them out on this, saying if you actually intend to abide by this fiscal responsibility rule, then it's going to mean cuts. So be honest with people. And I think, the Green proposals here, which are about investing in the future. So whether that's kind of investment in public services, investment in infrastructure, and saying that, that has an economic logic of its own, that has its own basis, which is basically, we need to create a kind of productive foundation for economic activity over the long run, but also pushing this line on a wealth tax. Now, there's been so much momentum behind a wealth tax in recent years, ever since, Piketty wrote Capital, really, it's become a really hot topic in loads of different countries all around the world. And indeed, some countries in Europe actually already have one. So I like the fact that the idea of a wealth tax is being pushed and is kind of centered in this manifesto. So I think there's a lot to be excited about. And if we do start to see the Greens being platformed more, which I know has been a problem up till now, and I know that they're very frustrated with, then they'll have the opportunity to ask these questions and press both Labour and the Tories on why they are both, the Tories less so because we know why they're doing it, but Labour in particular, why are you repeating this line that there is no money left when, we have these other costed manifestos that are delivering some of the priorities that people are really looking for, whether that's dealing with the cost of living crisis, dealing with the collapse of public services, or actually investing in decarbonisation.
We could talk about this for a whole hour, so we shouldn't go into too much detail. But while I've got you on, could you talk a bit more about wealth taxes? Because, I suppose one of the things I often hear about them, great in theory, obviously we'd love to do one, but they're actually quite technically difficult to implement. And I'm not sure what I think about that. How do they work? Where do they work well?
They can work in a lot of different ways. So, the way that we, the definition of wealth is, I suppose, the main thing. So there are kind of 4 main sources of wealth that we measure in something like the Wealth and Asset Survey. You have housing wealth, which is probably the biggest source of wealth. You have financial wealth. You have assets, items that you own that are relatively valuable. And there's one more, which I can't remember. But there are lots of different, basically buckets into which you can place people's assets to measure the stocks of their wealth. And this is the really important thing, which is that wealth is a stock. So income is a flow. Economists talk about, economies often in terms of stocks and flows. So you have a stock of something that think of as like a bucket that's full, or, at a certain level. And then you have a flow, which is kind of the stuff that's flowing into that bucket or flowing out of that bucket. Now, generally speaking, a lot of taxes are levied on flows. And that's for a number of reasons. It's because often they're easier to capture. So say, you have an income coming into your bank every month that's, predictable, reliable, easy to find, relatively easy to tax. Wealth as a stock is slightly more difficult to both measure and tax effectively. And, there are a lot of reasons for that. Firstly, you have to figure out precisely how you're measuring someone's wealth. So, the fact that there are things like extremely valuable items that can be included in a person's wealth, like, paintings or gold or whatever. How far do you go into assessing a person's wealth to be able to actually make the wealth tax as exhaustive as possible? It's like the timing according to which you kind of implement that tax as well. So is it kind of going to be annually? Is it going to be based on like the increase in the value of the assets over a certain period of time, like, for example, capital gains tax, which is to an extent an example of a wealth tax. And then there's the problem of kind of the ways in which people would try and get around this. So about avoidance and evasion. And for a number of reasons, it would potentially be easier for people to do that when it came to a wealth tax. But these are all issues that relate to how the tax is designed and, crucially, how the tax is enforced. Now, we know that wealth taxes are doable. They're challenging, but they're doable because, they exist in lots of places. And indeed, we have versions of them here in the UK. So the questions that we would have to be asking is really, what kind of wealth do we want to be capturing? So you might say, for example, like the capital gains tax is a good example, right? You have an exemption for primary residences because, whether or not this is a legitimate reason, you don't want to capture the uplift in the value of someone's first home. But then capital gains tax is levied on any other properties that you might have. So, this is about, again, what you're actually trying to tax and how you design the tax based on that. So that would be a consideration. But I don't think it's legitimate to say that we just couldn't do it because it's just too challenging to tax wealth as a stock, given that, we kind of already do that. The question is, the big question is how we enforce it. And actually, that is something that I think is missing from the discussion about tax at the moment. We lose so much money to avoidance and evasion every year. And that's, as we know, facilitated by the City of London. It's facilitated by the UK's network of tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions all over the world. And that is going to undermine any government's ability to levy any tax on anyone, but particularly a tax on wealth. So a wealth tax would have to come alongside big measures to cut down on avoidance and evasion, potentially alongside cooperation with other countries, and definitely alongside the UK kind of, being a bit more stringent when it comes to dealing with the institutions and countries that are facilitating tax avoidance and evasion, all of which are possible, by the way. It's ambitious, but possible. But it doesn't just help you with the wealth tax, it helps you with, the functioning of the tax system as a whole.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it is difficult, it's, I suppose, because it's a stock, not a flow. It's easy to do income tax because you get £3,000 a month and they take away £1,000 from it. It's very simple to implement that. But I suppose because it's complicated doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, especially as Piketty say, sort of wealth inequality is massively increasing. One problem people sort of put to politicians when they suggest a wealth tax is that people might just move abroad, or the wealthy might just move abroad. And this morning, co-leader of the Green Party, Adrian Ramsey, was quizzed on the Today programme about that question.
Let's concentrate on the NHS for a minute. £50 billion a year added?
Absolutely, and we're the party that's being honest in this election about the investment that's needed if we're going to tackle the fact that our NHS is severely overstretched.
Are you being honest about where it comes from then?
We are indeed, Justin, and we are publishing today a manifesto that is fully costed, that shows exactly where that funding will come and which will take levels of... How much do you think you
can get from a wealth tax?
The wealth tax is one of our proposals. That will raise $15 billion a year by the end of this next Parliament, and that is asking the very richest in society, the multimillionaires and billionaires, to pay modestly more in tax. So those with over 10 million in assets would pay 1% on assets over 10 million. Those with over $1 billion of assets would pay 2%. And that's one of our proposals.
How do you know they'll stay in the country?
Let's look at the evidence. We've consulted widely on this with the Wealth Tax Commission, with various academics and others. And if you look at where initiatives like this have been introduced, or where there were changes to the non-dom status, for example, people didn't leave. People are tied to this country because they love the country as much as we do.
I was saying this to James as well yesterday, wasn't I? And he said, well, you can't move lots of stuff. You can't move houses. That's Gary Stevenson's big thing as well. He's saying what we did to Roman Abramovich. We say we're taking away Chelsea from you. We couldn't just move Chelsea to a different country. It's a location-specific team. And there's quite a lot of examples of wealth like that. Another sort of quite radical policy, I think, that piqued my interest in the Green Manifesto concerned pay ratios. So they're saying that in public and private sector organisations, they'll campaign. Lots of the language in the manifesto is about campaigning, actually, because I suppose they assume they're not going to be the next government. A 10-to-1 pay ratio. So the person on the lowest rang of an organization's staff structure will get no less than 10% of what the CEO is earning. And this made me think, so what are currently the pay ratios in the UK right now and other countries? This is from Statistica. So the United States has the highest. There, the CEO of a company will likely earn 265 times more than the average worker in a company. In India, 229 times is the amount that a CEO can expect to earn more than the average wage in their company. The United Kingdom, not far behind. So in the UK, your average boss can expect to earn 200 times that of the average salary in their business. Countries like Germany, quite a lot lower, but still you've got 136 to 1 as the ratio. The Greens are suggesting 10 to 1. So Grace, that really puts sort of the radicalism of that policy in context, right? That's kind of like communism compared to what we have today.
Yeah, I mean, it would be extremely radical if it was implemented in that way. I think the argument would be both about kind of reducing excess at the top, but also about potentially using that as a measure to kind of lift up wages at the bottom end as well. So, the challenge to this, and I think it would be really difficult to do it immediately at a ratio of 10 to 1 across all institutions. You might start with public sector institutions and say you're going to kind of increase the ratio over time. Try and get to that ratio over time. But doing it across the whole economy immediately would be really, really challenging. And of course, in part, we know that the Greens aren't going to get into power themselves and be able to deliver this whole manifesto. So it's, we can view this as kind of acting as a challenge to the other major political parties and putting certain issues on the agenda, which I think is really important. And this is an issue that should be on the agenda. But, in terms of how it would work, yes, we need to reduce excessively high pay at the top. We've been talking about tax, for example. This could kind of fit in with a relatively middle-of-the-road, Miliband-esque type pre-distribution. If we know that we struggle to, raise taxes after income has been paid and after wealth has been accrued, then why not try to actually reduce the inequalities between those in the top and the bottom before that even happens? The second argument is, I think, arguably, more interesting or, potentially more effective in terms of dealing with a lot of the other economic problems that we have, which is a question around efficiency wages. So we have this really deep productivity problem in the UK. There is a stat which is that I think productivity in the UK has only risen 0.4 percentage points since 2008 per year, which is lower than the vast majority of other OECD economies. And there are two ways of thinking about the relationship between wages and productivity. One, which is the mainstream way, which says that when you get higher productivity, CEOs think, great, productivity is higher, we're going to pay our workers more. Now, of course, that isn't how the relationship works, because we know that relationship is hierarchical and based on kind of exploitation. So it's only when workers are capable of demanding higher wages that they actually get higher wages. But even within the mainstream tradition, there is actually another way of thinking about wages, which is something called efficiency wage theory. And that says that if you pay workers more, you actually get more productivity. And I saw something today, which was a radical experiment that the bosses in IKEA had done, which was they said that if they actually paid people more, gave them more time off, and gave them free childcare, then workers were suddenly happier and far more productive, which is, hardly surprising. There is quite a lot of evidence across the board for this idea of efficiency wages that, if you want higher productivity, you've got to make people feel valued and satisfied in the work that they do. So yeah, I think that that's potentially like a good argument for that, because, you know, none of the major political parties are also talking about this challenge, which is the productivity crisis. Labour is saying we're going to grow our way out of all of these problems. We don't need to raise taxes because ultimately we're just going to grow the economy, which means more for everyone. But you can't do that unless you fix the productivity challenge. And what underlies the productivity challenge? It's low wages, it's low investment, low public investment, all of the things that Labour have said they're actually not going to do.
Just because I haven't had you on during this general election yet, would you vote Green? Would you advise people to vote Green at this general election?
Oh, I'm 100% voting Green.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I'm voting Green. Yeah, I've said that I would. Well, I mean, I left Labour last year over Starmer's cutting off water and power comments, but I've kind of been engaging a bit more with a lot of the Green candidates and with the Greens as a whole over the course of the campaign. And actually, before I went up to Bristol for my book launch a while ago in like March, and met up with Carla, had a really good chat with her, and realised that she was, you know, really effective. And I think that's potentially an issue the Greens have had up to now, with Caroline Lucas being their kind of main figure. And she's obviously brilliant and a very effective political communicator. They haven't really had as many people that have been able to step into that gap. I think Carla's really good, really effective. And you've seen that across Question Time and all the other media that she's been doing. Zach Polanski as well is a very effective political communicator too. I think the issue that they have now, and this kind of relates to the point that you made at the start of the show about like how weird it is seeing two leaders, is that they have this like really democratic grassroots structure. It's like the opposite of the highly centralized political parties that we're used to. And that's worked for them up till now, because they've needed to kind of meet the needs of all of these different constituents in different parts of the country, from like, you know, people concerned about wind farms in, you know, the very middle of England through to, you know, young people who are very angry at Labour. So that structure's worked for them because they haven't had to have a really kind of effective main leader figure in the media that can say this is what the Greens are about. But I am kind of encouraged to see that I think Carla is increasingly filling that role, and she's going down the route of basically kind of, she wouldn't say this, but like eco-socialism or like, you know, progressive environmentalist policies. So yeah, I'm excited about her. I'm going to help her in Bristol. And I'm excited about, I hope that they do really well.
Yeah, I really hope she wins in Bristol. I think that would be very good for British politics. The United Nations has found that Israel has committed crimes against humanity in Gaza, including the crime of extermination. The allegations come from a 185-page report compiled by the UN's Commission of Inquiry. It was tasked with investigating potential war crimes committed by both Palestinian armed groups and Israeli military forces between October the 7th and the end of 2023. Now, the finding about extermination is incredibly significant. This is how the report defines extermination. So they say the killing of one or more persons, including by inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of part of a population, where the killing constituted or was part of a mass killing of members of a civilian population. So you're looking at a definition which looks quite similar to the one about genocide, and they're saying bringing about the destruction of part of a population. This is the behavior the report says Israel has carried out, which meets that definition. So they say the ISF had intentionally directed its attacks against the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. The number of casualties due to the military operations and high number of civilians displaced indicate that the attack as a whole was carried out indiscriminately without due consideration to civilian status, and the actions were conducted with the knowledge that they would cause extensive and widespread casualties, including deaths of civilians. The report continues. The victims were not singled out or targeted as individual civilians. On the contrary, it was evident they were intentionally targeted collectively because the ISF considered the civilian population as a whole to be associated with Hamas and other armed groups. They're saying they associated the civilian population as a whole with Hamas and then treated them accordingly. And, you know, we've heard from Israeli politicians that they're telling their military to treat Hamas like human animals, saying Hamas are human animals, all civilians are Hamas. then what do you get? Well, crimes against humanity, including the crime of extermination. The report also found that Israel has committed the crime against humanity of systematic gender-based persecution, in this case against Palestinian men. So it says that the IDF forces intentionally and systematically sexualized Palestinian men and boys with the aim of punishing and humiliating them in revenge for the October the 7th attack on southern Israel. Now, these were some of the grounds the Commission gave for that finding. So they say only men and boys were repeatedly filmed and photographed by soldiers while subjected to sexual violence or sexual torture and ill treatment, including while wholly or partly naked, blindfolded, kneeling on the ground, tied and or subjected to physical abuse. Digital footage of Palestinian men and boys wholly or partly naked was disseminated online by ISF soldiers operating in Gaza. Statements by Israeli officials regarding those responsible for the attacks on the 7th of October implicitly singled out male perpetrators, attempting to dehumanize and vilify Palestinian men with reference to human animals, barbarism, rapists, and ISIS. The Commission accuses Israel of carrying out several other crimes, including forcible transfer, murder, and inhuman and cruel treatment, which they say also amount to crimes against humanity due to their scale and systematic nature. In the report, Hamas and other armed groups are also charged with committing war crimes. That's on October the 7th. But while the Commission stresses the gravity of those violations of international law, it doesn't call them crimes against humanity. So the war crimes leveled at Hamas include the crimes of intentionally directing attacks against civilians, murder, inhumane treatment, and taking hostages. The Commission also investigated allegations of sexual violence, of war crimes that had been carried out by Palestinian militias and civilians on October the 7th. They report this. The Commission concludes on reasonable grounds that perpetrators committed sexual violence on the 7th of October in southern Israel, including at the Nova Festival, on Road 232, at the Nahal Oz military outpost, and at Kibbutzim Reim near Oz and Kfar Azar. This conclusion is based, among other factors, on the state and position in which many of the bodies of victims were found. Now, as you can see, that's a conclusion based on reasonable grounds rather than forensic evidence or the statements of survivors. And in another part of the report, the Commission explains why that is. So they say, investigating sexual and gender-based violence is always difficult, but the Commission has faced additional challenges in its investigation of sexual and gender-based violence on the 7th of October, including active attempts by Israeli authorities to obstruct the Commission's access to information related to sexual violence. Such measures include instructing medical professionals not to cooperate with the Commission. I think everyone agrees there's evidence of individual cases of sexual violence. Hamas did some appalling things on October the 7th, many appalling things on October the 7th. But this is interesting, this part, especially as we talked about this on the show before. Israel has been very, very aggressive towards institutions such as UN Women. Why aren't you talking more about the systematic, and what they say, the systematic sexual violence carried out by Hamas? And now it turns out that they're instructing medical professionals not to cooperate with the UN. So it does put the UN in an incredibly difficult position. Of course, it goes without saying, neither Israel nor Hamas come out well in this report. Both have committed war crimes, and that has basically been clear to everyone since the first week of this war, right? It's been very clear that both parties have committed war crimes. It's those charges of crimes against humanity, though, only applied to Israel in this report that are most striking. And that distinction hasn't been made clear in much Western reporting. So this was the headline on the report from the New York Times. So they say, UN Commission accuses both Israel and Palestinian groups of war crimes. So it's a headline that gives the impression that the report finds parity in the acts committed by both sides, when it really doesn't. The Guardian went with Israel and Hamas both committed war crimes. They say finds UN body. And the BBC's headline said, Israel Hamas accused of war crimes in a new UN report. Right. Now, again, these are headlines that suggest what we're looking at is two sides behaving badly who just can't get along. Right. They're accurate. Both Israel and Hamas were committed of war crimes. But what they don't mention is that Israel were also accused, or found to have really in this report, of committing crimes against humanity. Right. That's very, very significant. Hamas and Israel have been found by the UN to have committed war crimes, but only one party has been found to have committed crimes against humanity. And the key thing is this: only one party has the capacity to exterminate their neighbor, right? Even if Hamas wanted to do that, they have no capacity to do that whatsoever. And until the Western media is clear about that reality on the ground, Israel's crimes against humanity will continue. The key event of this election campaign so far has been Rishi Sunak leaving D-Day commemorations early. He did it to sit down for a pre-recorded interview with ITV. And 6 days later, that interview is now being released. This is how it started.
Prime Minister.
Gosh, hello.
Good to see you.
Very nice to see you. Hey, sorry to
I'm
have
well,
kept
thanks
you.
you. No, not at all. I know you've been in Normandy.
Yeah, it all just ran over. It was
course.
incredible, but it just ran over everything.
I'm sure it was
so apologies for keeping you.
No, not at all. I'm sure it was a powerful trip. I mean, so pertinent as well this year, considering what's happened in Ukraine.
Yeah, which I haven't seen President Biden's remarks, but I think that's kind of the echo, I think. What he said.
Did you get to meet any of the veterans, or were you?
Oh, no,
did you
gosh,
just
lots.
have to do the ceremonial?
Lots over yesterday and today.
Yeah,
I've already spoke to almost everyone that was there, I hope.
So he said, apologies, it ran over. So while the rest of Britain is outraged, Sunak left the event early. He, in fact, thought he'd been kept rather late. And the interview didn't get much better for Sunak.
When you are wealthier than the king, what do you do day to day to make sure you're still in touch with the kind of struggles ordinary people face? Have you ever gone without something?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, my family emigrated here with very little. And that's how I was raised. I was raised with the values of hard work.
What did you go without as a child?
We went out with lots of things, right? Because my parents wanted to put everything into our education, and that was a priority.
So what sort of things had to be sacrificed?
Lots of things, right? So,
Can you give me an example of
all sorts
something?
of things. So, like lots of people, there'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
Okay.
So that was something that we never had growing up, actually. But it was lots of things. But again, that's my experience is obviously going to be what my experience was. What is more important are my values and how I was raised. And I was raised in a household where hard work was really important. You had to work very hard, and family was important. Service to your community was important.
Lots of things, actually. We had to give up lots of things. No, there was Versace jeans that I was never bought. There's all sorts of sacrifices. Sky TV is what he goes for now. A very small proportion of the public at the time that he's talking about had Sky TV. It's not really struggling. Credit there, though, too, I think, Paul Brand, because what I found very frustrating in this conversation, a separate conversation but related, about the VAT that the Labour Party is going to levy on private schools, is I keep hearing people. So I was on Storm Huntley's show, which is the one after Jeremy Vine on Channel 5 yesterday, and they had this rugby player. I was very jealous of his he looked amazing, very jealous of his physique. But I wasn't that impressed by some of his points, because he was sort of saying, like my parents sent me to private school, but they worked really hard. We didn't even go on holiday. And like, as a host, you should say, really? You didn't go on holiday? Like, did you go on holiday? Did you go on one holiday in this? Because I think when posh people sort of say this, they gave up holidays. What they mean is that someone else in their class was rich enough to go to both the Maldives and, skiing in the Alps every summer, and their family could only do one of those things every summer, right? So I like that Paul Brand was like, be specific. What did you have to give up? And the only thing he could think of was a skybox. Of course, I think if you're very wealthy and everyone knows you're very wealthy, you should just be honest about that and say, look, I know that I'm from a privileged background, and I won't have struggled in the way that many people in the country are struggling right now. I'm not going to pretend anything other than that. But I think you can see from my actions that hasn't, influenced how I've governed, right? That would have been a good answer. But Rishi Sunak is a terrible, terrible politician. Grace, did you have a skybox growing up?
I did. I'm going to have to take your advice, Michael, and just own up to my poshness, which I don't think anyone is particularly surprised about. But, what I think is really funny about this interview is that he has no idea the way that he's coming across. And I totally get this, because I know so many of these types. And this obviously is, I was upper middle class, well off, whatever. When you go to Oxford, for example, you meet people who have, like Rishi Sunak, been to public schools, for example, Eton, and then come to Oxford. And literally live on another planet and have never really met or engaged with people outside of their very small social clique. And their entire lives and their entire identities are built around their status within this very small social clique. So to them, it often does feel as though they have had to sacrifice a lot, or they've had to give things up. Because for Rishi Sunak, he could have spent all this time becoming a multi billionaire, or, doing other things that would have potentially given him more success than what he's had as prime minister. And I just think it is really funny that he is still very much in that headspace of kind of just not being aware of how different his life and his experiences are to the vast majority of people in the UK. And it's so obvious. What's interesting is that there are lots of other politicians, aren't as wealthy as Rishi Sunak, but potentially had much kind of posher upbringings, who are fantastic at this sort of thing. Farage, for example, he's so good at, creating false links with the average person. Trump as well, he's extraordinarily rich, and yet he's able to stand up as though he's this kind of authentic representative of the working class. I think what's interesting about both of those characters is just their shamelessness. Like, they will never give in to the idea that they should feel in any way less or ashamed because of their upbringing, or indeed anything else about their personalities. And in doing so, they're kind of, I think, almost speaking for the people who feel like they shouldn't have to feel ashamed for, I don't know, saying immigrants should be sent home or people shouldn't claim benefits or whatever, and turning that into a really key component of their identity as a politician makes them really successful. And Sunak has not done that. He's not even aware of what he's doing, which speaks to the fact that he is, as you said, not a very good politician and will be remembered as such. I don't think he'll particularly mind, because he'll probably go on and make tons and tons of money and acquire status in many other ways. But here we are.
Yeah, I think it does probably have a lot to do with who they have, been in contact with, right? Because I suppose both Donald Trump and Nigel Farage, I think, and Boris Johnson as well, probably have met people from quite a lot of different walks of life, right? Donald Trump's spent a lot of time with lots of porn stars, right? Who don't tend to come from particularly privileged backgrounds. Boris Johnson does seem to be able to sort of socialize with any Tom, Dick and Harry, right? So it does seem like Rishi Sunak is not only very posh, but he just hasn't met many people who aren't posh. And we saw that actually in that now infamous clip of him as a child. I can't remember why he was being interviewed, but it's from some sort of documentary or a news piece about his family. He's a schoolboy at the time. And he says, I've got all sorts of friends. I've got upper class, working class. Well, no, actually not working class. It's amazing. And that's how you end up with answers like this. Of course, the Skybox story, it was a farcical answer, but the story itself has become somewhat farcical. This was a tweet from a Sun journalist today. So she's called Martina Bett. Starmer tells me he certainly didn't have Sky TV growing up, and even a broken window couldn't be fixed promptly in his household. He adds, I am not pleading poverty, but I am just saying these are some of the issues that arise in a working class family. So Starmer certainly didn't have a Sky TV box. Of course, many were quick to point out online that Keir Starmer was born in 1962, and Sky TV wasn't launched until 1989, when Starmer was 26. So the Labour leader would have needed time travel, not richer parents, to enjoy the benefits, of a satellite dish in his childhood years. Grace, I was looking for that clip, and I feel like it wasn't actually videoed. It was just something he said to a journalist. In the clip he was given, he said, I'm going to leave it to Rishi Sunak to talk about what he didn't and didn't have as a child. But do you think Starmer seems wooden, but I actually think people have a better impression of him when it comes to sort of understanding ordinary people. What do you think?
I think when you look at the polling, most people say that they don't really feel as though they know anything about Starmer. So, I don't think they have necessarily made an impression of him. I think there was a while ago, they did a kind of word cloud of words that people associated with Starmer. And a lot of them were just kind of bland, boring, not sure. So in some senses, that's, I suppose, an asset. And I think this is really Labour's strategy. They're going up against a party that is imploding. And they think they can just kind of, do the Homer Simpson, go back into the bush and try and not put a foot wrong. And Starmer kind of epitomizes that, right? Because he hasn't done very much, if anything, to engage with voters and try and say, this is who I am as a politician. Admittedly, he hasn't failed and given a disastrous view of who he is as a politician, as Rishi Sunak has. But he just hasn't kind of really given people anything. I was also looking at some polling today that showed that people kind of vaguely trust Labour on a few things. So like dealing with the cost of living crisis, fixing the NHS, just because of the value of branding and its reputation. But they couldn't name any potential policies that Labour would have used to deal with any of those crises. Like the vast majority of people can't name a single policy that, Labour is likely to implement. So I think there's this vague sense around Starmer, around Labour, that they can't be quite as bad as the Tories and he can't be quite as bad as Sunak, but people just don't really know what to expect from him. And maybe that's an asset given the kind of election that we're going into. But it's, I think not particularly inspiring. And it does mean that maybe, we see a bit of a surge in in support for the Greens, and they do lose a couple of seats like Bristol Central. But really, I think the main thing is what it means for his policy agenda when he actually gets into power. Because the only thing we really know for sure at this point is that they are not spending any money.
We are doing a slightly shorter show tonight so that we can get ready for our stream of the debate or the leaders event, which is coming up on Sky. So Grace, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
And thank you everyone for watching. Stay on our channel for our live coverage of Sky's leader event in Grimsby, featuring Sunak and Starmer. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.